This is Mike Price, author of the Forgotten Horrors series of movie history books. One cannot really characterize Great Britain's Hammer films as forgotten in the strict sense of the term, but so what of that? Enough revealing particulars have been generally forgotten about Hammer and about its signature Frankenstein franchise that we find it irresistible to explore the series from a daring and elegant beginning to a rather uneven finish. Our emphasis will fall upon the film's essential unifying force, the distinguished actor Peter Cushing.
Look, I admit he isn't a particularly good-looking specimen at present, but don't forget, one's facial character is built up by what lies behind it, in the brain.
Cushing is predominant throughout, or almost throughout, from 1957 through 1974. He is conspicuous by absence in an ill-advised detour called Horror of Frankenstein from 1970. And Cushing is likewise missing from a false start television pilot from 1958, although his proxy in that one, Anton Diffring, manages to channel a Cushing-styled influence to impressive effect.
Patience. 3 more days, and he will live again.
It could have been perfect. I made it to be perfect.
But we are getting ahead of the game here, and the game is not even officially afoot as yet. Let us say for now that the year is 1935, that founder William Hines has launched Hammer Productions Limited in London, and that his early output under the Hammer brand includes a striking example of psychological horror, The Mystery of the Marie Celeste, or Phantom Ship to invoke the American title. The attitude will spread to define the studio over the gradual greater span. The occasional foray into weird mystery will persist, peaking again in 1948 with The Man in Black, a tale of murder and maddened intrigues, and again in 1951 with the hiring of director Terence Fisher for a film noir called The Last Page.
A gal whose lips were made for loving, but whose arms could lead a man to one false step, then blackmail and murder.
Fisher will provide a catalyst for Hammer's greater identification with unabashed horror as a defining element. Fisher will ease into that pivotal role in 1953 as director of Hammer's first science fiction pictures, Four-Sided Triangle and Spaceways.
Amazing than the atom bomb is the fantastic space station built more than 1,000 miles up. Howard Duff, a man dedicated to the scientific conquest of space, deceived by a woman dedicated to pleasure.
By 1955, Hammer has moved decisively into horrific territory with the Quatermass experiment and similarly inclined leanings. We refer the viewer to our companion Cinema Force survey of the Quatermass series. A nostalgically retrospective trend has emerged in America, with post-war encore releases of Universal Pictures' Gothic horrors of the Depression into wartime years, Frankenstein and the like, as theatrical attractions.
All the men gathered, all the fools.
American International Pictures and their ilk had begun to feed a dawning popular appetite with new low-budgeted productions.
What is it?
I don't know.
A television package of 1957 et sec, Shock Theater, flooded local broadcasting stations nationwide with many of those 1930s, 1940s Universal titles. An American Anglophile producer, Max Rosenberg, who already had begun to tap into a parallel craze for rock and roll musical films, approached Michael Carreras at Hammer Films with a pitch to develop a project he called Frankenstein and the Monster. There followed Hammer's 1956-1957 production of The Curse of Frankenstein, This was sequelized in 1958 by The Revenge of Frankenstein, in 1964 by The Evil of Frankenstein, in 1967 by Frankenstein Created Woman, in 1969 by Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, in 1970 by the broad-stroke attempted comedy of The Horror of Frankenstein, without Peter Cushing, and in 1974 with a restoration of Cushing's central character for Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. Herewith, an episodic inventory.
Unfortunately, being tone deaf, I'm unable to appreciate it.
That means your experiment will not succeed.
You're going to help me, Paul. Whatever you say.
The Curse of Frankenstein, a radically inventive variant upon James Whale's Universal production of Frankenstein, 1931, established Hammer's more lasting identity, emphasizing the arrival with a lavish color palette by camera chief Jack Asher and a classically attuned dramatic score by James Bernard. Worldwide box office success led not only to a prompt sequel and a generation's span thereof, but also to such immediate follow-throughs as Horror of Dracula, 1958, and The Mummy, 1959. Hammer-style horror became practically a genre unto itself.
For God's sake, save her!
Screenwriter Jimmy Sangster, who adapted Mary Shelley's 19th century novel for Hammer, remained officially ignorant of Rosenberg's pitch and its attached script or treatment by Rosenberg's partner, Milton Subotsky. Rosenberg and Subotsky were dismissed at length with a token finder's fee settlement. Their subsequent development of the Amicus Pictures brand would pose competition for Hammer over the long term. Sangster wrote from the practical standpoint of a production supervisor, more so than a conventional scenarist, however artistically attuned. He was aware of budgetary restrictions that would deny Hammer such luxuries as Universal-style mob scenes or elaborate scenic construction. Sangster also professed not to have studied the Universal Frankenstein pictures of 1931 through 1948. Hammer's production budget on Curse ran to £65,000 in 1950s calculations, significantly less than what Universal Pictures would spend, about $800,000, on its 1957 black-and-white production of a comparably successful genre picture, The Incredible Shrinking Man.
What do you think of it? It's horrible. Paul, the features are not important. What matters is I'm creating a being that will live and breathe.
Peter Cushing, a busy actor who had become prominent in British television, landed his first big-screen leading role as the surgeon Victor Frankenstein. Paired with 6'5" Christopher Lee's portrayal of the reanimated corpse creation, Cushing countered the monster's feral immensity with an intellectual ferocity bordering on OCD that would contrast strikingly with the 1931 film's pairing of a neurotic, amoral Colin Clive and a near-sympathetic Boris Karloff. Hammer refrained from duplicating aspects of Universal's 1931 film, and so it fell upon makeup artist Phil Leakey to design an appearance for the creature bearing no resemblance to the Boris Karloff original created by Jack Pierce. Production of The Curse of Frankenstein began with an investment of £65,000 in November of 1956 at Bray Studios near Berkshire, England, with a scene showing Baron Frankenstein harvesting a cadaver from the site of a hanging. In Switzerland, 1860, Baron Victor Frankenstein, Peter Cushing awaits execution for the slaying of his maid and consort Justine. He relates this story to a priest, played by Alex Gallier.
Perhaps you had better start from the beginning. Where did it all begin?
At age 15, the Baron, played at that age by Melvin Hates, had inherited control of the Frankenstein estate. He assumed the support of his Aunt Sophia and a cousin Elizabeth, Noel Hood and Sally Walsh, and enlisted an established scientist, Paul Krempe, Robert Urquhart, as his mentor. The adult Victor and Krimpy had begun a series of death-defiant experiments. Their resurrection of a dog prompted Victor to propose the assembly of a human being from bodily parts. Paul objected to the corpse mining project. Victor's cousin, now an adult, Hazel Court, became his fiancée.
I'm Elizabeth, Victor's cousin. Didn't he tell you about me?
No, he did not.
The assembly of Victor's humanoid creation had involved more or less legitimately obtained croakers. Victor sought the brain, then, of the distinguished Professor Bernstein, Paul Hartmuth, the better to obtain intellect and wisdom.
If you step back a little, you'll see better. Look out, Professor, look out!
Frankenstein staged the murder of the professor to seem an accident. Paul's attempt to halt the removal resulted in damage to the brain. Elizabeth refused Paul's entreaties that she should leave the house.
Won't you understand you're in real danger?
Victor enlivened the creature, Christopher Lee, but the damaged brain left it violent and unreasoning. The creature escaped on a killing rampage, only to be gunned down and buried in secret.
I don't think I shall ever forgive you for what you've done. Ever.
The servant, Justine, now claiming a pregnancy by Victor, threatens to reveal his strange experiments. He had her killed by the monster. Paul returned on the eve of Elizabeth's marriage to Victor. Victor showed Paul the revived creature. Paul proposed to report him to the authorities. The monster escaped, threatening Elizabeth, who was shot by accident in the struggle. She fell unconscious. Victor set the monster ablaze, and it fell into an acid vat, all evidence destroyed. As the extended flashback ends, the priest dismisses Victor's account. Paul denies any such knowledge. Paul joins Elizabeth outside the prison. Victor is led away to face the executioner. Commercial success greeted Curse in England and in America with extended or holdover engagements during a period of time when horror pictures seldom played more than a week in first-run bookings. Stuffy British critics found the film debasing, per the Sunday Times, and degrading, per the Tribune. The monthly film bulletin decried a preoccupation with, quote, disgusting charnelry, unquote, but reserved more favorable words for John Hollingsworth's musical score, for Edward Marshall's art direction, and for Jack Asher's color-saturated photography. The American critics spoke more agreeably, with Film Bulletin hailing a rattling good horror show, a representative observation. The New York Times' self-important Bosley Crowther called Curse routine, betraying a short memory by declaring himself hard-pressed to distinguish it from earlier such pictures. The influential trade journal Variety found Cushing's portrayal almost believable and found Fisher's direction and Asher's camera compositions of a high order. The greater distinction from the Universal Frankenstein pictures of the Depression into wartime years is that the recurring figure, the connective tissue, is the Baron himself, and not any consistently recognizable Frankenstein monster. With Christopher Lee's creature decisively destroyed and the threatened execution of the Baron left imminent, the path becomes clear for Peter Cushing to develop the character to nuanced extremes over the greater course. Which brings us to that first sequel, which picks up where Curse had trailed away. Cushing's Baron has not forgotten the brush-off that he had received from that priest.
In the year 1860, I, Baron Frankenstein, was sentenced to death on the guillotine.
The Revenge of Frankenstein. In 1860, Baron Victor Frankenstein, Peter Cushing again, sentenced to death, arranges to have a priest dispatched and buried as his proxy, with the aid of a deformed dwarf named Karl Oskar Kittak.
A baron? Well, shall we get any more for him? I ain't never seen a real live baron before.
3 years later, Victor, now traveling under the name of Stein, has become a successful private physician in Carlsbruck, while also relishing the opportunities of a charity hospital.
I can't breathe. That thing's so cold. Can you hear the palpitations with that? Wouldn't it be better to use your ear?
Hans Cleve, Francis Matthews, a junior member of the Medical Society, recognizes Victor and imposes himself as an apprentice. Victor and Hans seek to implant a brain into a flawless body. Karl agrees to volunteer his brain for a robust body, having become infatuated with Margaret, Eunice Gayson, an attractive assistant.
If the brain hadn't been damaged, my work would have been hailed as the greatest scientific achievement of all time.
The transplant leaves Karl, now played by Michael Gwynn, in a panic.
Dr. Stein!
He persuades Margaret to free him. It develops ominously that a chimpanzee, re-equipped with the brain of an orangutan, has turned cannibalistic. Karl hides in Victor's laboratory and kills a janitor. He eludes capture and barges in upon a formal reception, where he calls Victor by his real name, Frankenstein, and then dies.
Frankenstein! Frankenstein!
Victor denies his true identity. The medical authorities find the priest's body in Victor's purported grave. At the hospital, the inmates attack Victor. Hans rushes his dying mentor to the lab.
You know what to do.
Yes, I know.
The police arrive to arrest Victor, but Hans dismisses them after showing them the battered corpse of Frankenstein. Hans transplants Victor's brain into a new body, prepared in anticipation of such a development. Later in London, Hans assists the resurrected Victor, now calling himself Dr. Frank, in a new setting.
How nice to see you. But I have escaped the guillotine, and I shall avenge the death of my creation.
A standard rule among mystery and suspense writers goes like this: kill your protagonist and then get him out of it. When Hammer Chief Michael Carreras assigned Jimmy Sangster to write this sequel, Sangster replied, "I killed Baron Frankenstein in the first film." Carreras gave Sangster a 6-week deadline, adding, "You'll think of something." Production began in January of 1958, within days of the wrapping of principal photography on Horror of Dracula, another defining Hammer title, with Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, and director Terence Fisher. For The Revenge of Frankenstein, Hammer enlisted Leonard Salcedo to compose an unnerving musical score.
This is something I am proud of.
With the recurring involvement of Jack Asher as cinematographer, Bernard Robinson as designer, and Phil Leakey as makeup artist. America saw the initial release in June of 1958 with generally favorable critical notices from Variety and Motion Picture Daily and Harrison's Reports, outweighing a dismissive review from Monthly Film Bulletin. The UK opening followed in August. Encouraged by the welcoming response, Hammer lurched ill-advisedly into a transatlantic spin-off for television, Tales of Frankenstein, which fared less favorably as a consequence of corporate intrigues and treacheries.
So infamous were his exploits that his name stands forever as a symbol of all that is shocking, unspeakable, forbidden.
Tales of Frankenstein is an orphaned television pilot filmed in 1958 as a joint production of Hammer Films and Columbia Pictures. The film combines elements of the Hammer and Universal Pictures versions of Frankenstein. The Columbia connection proved compatible with the Universal trademarks. Owing to Columbia's TV reissue deal for the Universal Frankenstein series of 2 decades prior. The pilot was titled The Face in the Tombstone Mirror, directed by Universal veteran Kurt Siodmak, from a teleplay by Henry Kuttner and his wife, Catherine L. Moore.
It is true, I was once involved in certain experiments with animals, research on prolonging the span of life. But as for humans, that kind of experimentation is against the law.
Baron Frankenstein, now portrayed by Anton Diffring with a Cushing-like air of arrogance, finds his monstrous creation rebellious and homicidal. Electrocuted in a struggle, the ad hoc monster leaves Frankenstein on the search for a brain of greater intelligence and docility.
Your brain came from the skull of a murderer, and you still wanted to kill. But with the right brain. The brain of an intelligent man. A good man.
Christine Halpert and her ailing husband, Paul Halpert, Helen Westcott, and Richard Bull, seek treatment from the Baron. The Baron turns them away, and Paul dies in the nearby village.
Mrs. Halpert, somehow I feel guilty.
The Baron bribes a cemetery hand, Peter Brocco, to allow a body-snatching expedition, but Christine traces the theft to the Baron.
You can remember. Your brain is alive again, Halpert. It can function. It has intelligence. You wanted life, and I have given it to you. Yours was the brain that I needed, and it's the brain that makes it all work.
As Paul reacts to his new body, he becomes violent and pursues the Baron. Christine demands to know what the Baron has done.
At the funeral, when you told me you had a sense of guilt, I didn't believe you. I know now I was wrong.
Paul, his brain now transferred to a monstrous new body, pursues the Baron in a desperate chase through the woodlands. Christine appeals to her husband's gentler nature.
Leave him alone. Listen to me. He's not to blame. He did what we asked him to do. We had no right to ask him to commit a crime against God.
Accused of grave robbery, Frankenstein states his case.
And I don't think either of us would let anything stand in the way of fulfilling our respective destinies.
Hammer and Columbia planned 26 such episodes, emphasizing the obsessions of Baron Frankenstein. Columbia sought to utilize the Universal Pictures themes. Hammer preferred a basis in its inaugural feature film, The Curse of Frankenstein. Hammer chose Anton Diffring for his resemblance to Peter Cushing. Diffring would remain with Hammer's feature film factory, starring in 1959's The Man Who Could Cheat Death.
Too late.
Columbia rejected 6 teleplays that Hammer had ordered. The monster would resemble the Universal Pictures aspect, as popularized since 1931 by Boris Karloff and his successors. The inheritor of the television role was burly Don McGowan, a veteran of Universal's Black Lagoon series. Anthony Hines salvaged various orphan scripts that would serve further Frankenstein features. A scenario by A.R. Rawlinson found Frankenstein bringing to life a soulless woman, retrieved as the basis of Frankenstein Created Woman. Another, by Peter Bryan, addressed the attempted hypnotic control of a resurrected creature, as developed in 1964 for The Evil of Frankenstein.
It's easy to see how he got his promotion. That ring!
Director Freddie Francis took charge in 1964 for The Evil of Frankenstein, third in the formal Hammer series, and the first to jettison the concepts of original screenwriter Jimmy Sangster.
Who can have done this evil thing?
Generally perceived as a jarring break from an established continuity, the film nonetheless benefits from Peter Cushing's further development of the title role as a figure of indignation and careless haste.
You are interrupting my work.
Your work. The work. Gentle.
Hands. Please, Father. You can...
A body-snatching caper gone awry forces Victor Frankenstein and his servant Hans, Sandor Ilyes, to abandon their laboratory and return to the abandoned chateau of Frankenstein, where they hope to retrieve valuable items. They rescue a young deaf-mute woman, Katie Wilde, from a gang of thugs. Near the town of Karlstadt, Frankenstein is enraged to find that his property has been ransacked by scavengers. While visiting a carnival incognito, Frankenstein notices a ring from his stolen treasures, in possession of the mayor, David Hutchison. Betrayed by an indignant outburst, Frankenstein takes refuge with a hypnotist named Zoltan. Zoltan, played by Peter Woodthorpe, is arrested in an affray with the police, and Frankenstein escapes. Frankenstein and Hans break into the mayor's home, only to flee once again.
Good night.
The mute girl leads them to a cavern. Frankenstein finds an earlier creation of his frozen within the cave. The figure can only represent an untold story. He and Hans free the creature, now played by career wrestler Kiwi Kingston. The reflection of Universal Pictures' Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, with its icebound motif, is self-evident. When restored to life, the creature proves unresponsive. The Baron approaches the hypnotist, Zoltan, with an invitation to reinvigorate the creature's mind.
Fail? Me fail? There isn't a man born a woman that I can't put under.
Though banished from the village as a charlatan, Zoltan agrees, developing a vengeful agenda of his own.
That's not human. It's a monster.
Nevertheless, he has a good brain and excellent eyes.
Zoltan manipulates the creature to respond only to his commands, using it as an instrument of vengeance upon the town's authorities. Ordered to vacate then, Zoltan directs the creature to kill Frankenstein, only to find himself slain as the order backfires.
Go back! Go back and kill him!
Enraged, the creature sets the lab ablaze. Hans and the girl watch from a distance as the chateau topples from a cliff, presumably killing Frankenstein and his malfunctioned creature. Scenarist Anthony Hines based the screenplay upon a narrative outline that Peter Bryan had prepared in 1958 for the abandoned Tales of Frankenstein series. The film breaks continuity from the two establishing films, The Curse of Frankenstein and The Revenge of Frankenstein.
Perfectly preserved.
He must have fallen into the glacier. It's as if he was waiting for you.
The image of the icebound monster is indeed a hearkening back to Universal's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, though explored in an unusual direction that draws more from psychology than from renegade surgery. Filmed during the autumn of 1963 at Bray Studios in Berkshire and in the Black Park region of Buckinghamshire, The Evil of Frankenstein occurred during Hammer's flexible co-production deal with Columbia Pictures, which in turn enabled the occasional alliance with Universal Pictures. This film's version of the monster resembles the aspect of Universal's original Frankenstein monster makeup, although Kiwi Kingston's sheer athletic physicality lends an occasional clownish sense. The theatrical cut of Evil of Frankenstein was augmented in 1966 with a distracting subplot of additional scenes filmed in Hollywood. These were fitted into a 1968 television premiere. In its original 1964 engagements, the film prompted the New York Times to hail a succinct pull and a curious dignity, with its indictments of middle-class hypocrisy and superstitious intolerance, despite its tendency to go hog wild, quote-unquote, in the rambunctious finale. The trade paper Variety cited Francis's assured direction, but found a quality of unintentional humor in its preposterous circumstances. A theatrical reissue with Evil of Frankenstein reduced to double bill support attracted rowdy laughter at points where the violence impressed many customers as verging upon slapstick.
They have short memories, I hope.
Frankenstein. The name stands for fear. Frankenstein. He shocks the world as he mocks the devil. Frankenstein. He creates monsters of men. Frankenstein's most terrifying experiment comes to life.
Terence Fisher rejoined the franchise as director in 1967 for Frankenstein Created Woman, which pairs Peter Cushing as the Baron with Susan Denberg as a tragic and vengeance-driven new monster.
Kill him. Kill him, Christina.
John Elder's screenplay elaborates upon the mind control conceits of Evil of Frankenstein and forges into a spiritual or metaphysical realm concerning the relationship of the soul to the flesh it inhabits.
Who am I?
You're a very, very lovely girl, my dear.
Robert Morris portrays Hans Werner, son of an executed criminal. Hans is an assistant to Cushing's Dr. Frankenstein and his colleague, Dr. Hertz, played by Thorley Walters. The chemistry of Cushing and grandfatherly Thorley Walters is reminiscent of the actor's Holmes-and-Watson portrayal in a Hammer masterpiece of 1958, The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's classic masterpiece of mystery, suspense, and horror, The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Here Frankenstein and Hertz seek to entrap a departed soul, the better to enable a transference or transmigration of life forces.
Was it trapped within me? Could it be trapped forever?
Hans loves Christina Cleave, Miss Denberg, the near-paralytically handicapped daughter of an innkeeper, Alan McNaughton. Three local hooligan dandies, Anton, Johann, and Carl, played by Peter Blythe, Derek Folds, and Barry Warren, threaten the publican and mock Christina's deformities.
Oh dear, she nearly spelt it.
After a violent standoff, the rowdies leave, only to return as burglars. They beat the innkeeper to death. While Christina departs unaware to consult a physician about her condition, Hans finds himself accused of her father's murder. Foredoomed by circumstantial evidence, by his temperamental nature, and by his history as the son of a condemned man.
I know that he has been accused of murder. As a psychologist, I can only say that I consider it extremely unlikely.
Despite a vigorous defense from Frankenstein, Hans is executed. Frankenstein, of course, captures Hans' departing soul. Christina, distraught upon returning, is retrieved from an attempted suicide. Frankenstein and Hertz transfer Hans' soul into her body and subject her to a surgical rehabilitation. Now physically near perfect but afflicted with amnesia, Christina gradually regains her senses, only to be taken over by the vengeful intellect of Hans.
When you first came here, you were not as you are now, you know.
Christina destroys Anton and Karl. Frankenstein and Hertz sense the overriding truth, too late to prevent Christina from taking vengeance against Johann. Ignoring Frankenstein's entreaties, Christina drowns herself, now more decisively. Frankenstein, having seemingly found a conscience amid the ruins of his moral bearings, turns away in futile disappointment. Frankenstein Created Woman had been conceived in 1958 by turns as a teleseries installment or then as a proposed sequel to The Revenge of Frankenstein.
Frankenstein Created Woman.
Who am I?
The title was meant as a takeoff upon Roger Vadim's then-current international sensation, And God Created Woman. Lost timeliness aside, the film could only benefit from its delay until 1966, for Peter Cushing's interpretation of the Baron had evolved to a more nuanced state of self-awareness.
What do you mean by steps?
There are procedures laid down for the dispersal of witches. As well you know, sir.
You mean you'll burn me?
Cushing's interpretation here is more catalyst than protagonist, yielding generously to emphasize Susan Denberg's conflicts between wronged innocence and bloodthirsty vengeance.
Where's the head?
I have done what you told me.
The Variety Review, by turns, praised the film's excellent technical aspects and hammered an overt influence of other and better written screen efforts, quote unquote. The influence of H.P. Lovecraft is evident in the notion of soul transmigration as depicted in a 1933 story called The Thing on the Doorstep. The Monthly Film Bulletin lamented a lack of concentration upon Cushing's obsessions in favor of the vendetta against the spoiled brat antagonists. In a curated retrospective of favorite films in 1987, the filmmaker Martin Scorsese wrote that Frankenstein Created Woman had achieved a quality of implied metaphysics, close to something sublime.
It's hard to believe that this beautiful young thing, Veronica Carlson, is in a Frankenstein movie of all things. Now, this is called Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. That's right. Well, is he? Or is that giving away trade secret? Well, you are left wondering whether he's been destroyed or not.
For revenge. Do I not deserve revenge?
For the 1969 entry of Hammer's Frankenstein saga, authors Bert Batt and Anthony Nelson Keyes joined director Terence Fisher on Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, starring Peter Cushing, Freddie Jones, Veronica Carlson, and Simon Ward. The story concerns Dr. Frankenstein's campaign of tyranny in an attempt to obtain secrets known to a former colleague, now confined to an asylum.
We were involved in the problems of transplanting the human brain. We both achieved it. Utterly impossible. I assure you it isn't.
A doctor is slain by a masked intruder while a thief enters a hidden laboratory. The masked man enters the lab, carrying the doctor's severed head. The burglar flees. The assailant proves to be Baron Victor Frankenstein.
Not a blood. Now whose is it, and where did it come from? Now come on, come on.
The thief reports the slaying to a police inspector, Frisch, Thorley Walters lending an intrusive element of befuddled humor. Frankenstein, now traveling under the name of Finner, takes lodgings with landlady Anna Spengler, Veronica Carlson. Her fiancé, Karl Holst, Simon Ward, is an intern at an asylum where Frankenstein's former assistant, Frederick Brandt, George Pravda, has been committed as a madman. Frankenstein learns of Carl's secret life as a narcotics thief, purely benevolent intentions, of course, and blackmails Carl to help him abduct Brandt.
You're wasting your time. You'll never get him out. Of course I will. But remember what happens to you. And Anna, if I don't.
The better to tap the lunatic's repressed memories of a forbidden experiment. Carl and the Baron are confronted by a laboratory guard, whom Carl stabs. Frankenstein uses Carl and Anna to abduct Brandt. When Brandt collapses from a heart attack, Frankenstein and Carl kidnap the asylum's overseer, Richter, Freddie Jones, as a recipient of Brandt's brain.
I can transplant his brain. If I don't, it'll die through lack of oxygen. I must therefore transfer it to a healthy body to keep it alive.
In a gratuitous scene demanded by Hammer executive James Carreras over objections from director Fisher and the leading players, Frankenstein ravishes Anna. The imposition proves a premature portent of Anna's misfortunes to come. Frankenstein and Carl install Brandt's brain into Richter's cranium. Brandt's wife, Maxine Audley, suspects Frankenstein in connection with the abduction.
Even now you can't leave him in peace. Where is he? What have you done to him?
He is downstairs.
She rejects his assertion that he has remedied Brandt's madness. In a hidden lair, the Brandt-Richter creature recoils in disgust from its transformed appearance. Anna stabs the creature, which escapes. Enraged, Frankenstein kills Anna. The creature reaches the home he had known as Dr. Brandt, but Mrs. Brandt rebuffs him. The creature douses the house with a flammable accelerant and orders Mrs. Brandt to leave.
Go by the back staircase and move quietly.
As Frankenstein and Carl arrive in pursuit, the creature sets the house ablaze.
I fancy that I am the spider and you are the fly, Frankenstein.
Before Frankenstein can escape with his experimental documents, Carl attacks him. The creature sidelines Carl and carries Frankenstein into the burning house. Variety, reviewing the film in terms of box office prospects, called the film good enough of its low-key type, unquote, singling out Arthur Grant's camera work. The Monthly Film Bulletin called it the most spirited Hammer horror in some time. Damnation by faint praise, in other words. Peter Cushing's most ferocious interpretation of Baron Frankenstein would stand for the time being as a benchmark. Only to be interrupted by Hammer's own intentional derailing of its series with a forced comedy called Horror of Frankenstein, coming right up.
Go away! For God's sake, go away!
To the reunion of old friends.
Why, Victor, why?
As the series' only film without Peter Cushing, 1970's The Horror of Frankenstein stands apart as a half-hearted parody of 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein.
How do you do? I'm Victor Frankenstein.
Produced and directed by the series' founding screenwriter, Jimmy Sangster, the travesty stars Ralph Bates, Kate O'Mara, Veronica Carlson, and David Prowse. An original musical score by Malcolm Williamson weighs heavily upon an attempted air of humor.
Can't see anything.
Gallows humor, that is, affirming Hammer's inconsistent self-betrayal of its original intentions. Bates portrays Victor Frankenstein as an arrogant horn-dog womanizer.
You'll see me in my grave before I let you gallivant off to Vienna for the next few years.
Angered by his noble family's rejection of his scientific ambitions, Victor murders his father, George Belbin, with a shotgun trap, the better to assume control of the family's fortune. As a medical student in Austria, Victor faces expulsion over an affair with the dean's daughter.
Welcome home, Herr Baron.
Thank you, Elise. You're looking remarkably well.
Thank you, sir.
You've put on weight in a couple of places.
A composite body assembled from human parts revives as a homicidal monster, played by David Prowse. Hidden away in a vat, the creature is destroyed when Frankenstein mistakenly floods the container with acid, none too soon. The horror of Frankenstein had begun as a straightforward remake of 1957's Curse, with Sangster invited to rewrite or revise a proposed script by Jeremy Burnham, an actor and scenarist. Sangster declined until Hammer offered him a deal to rewrite and produce and direct. He agreed on condition that he be allowed a humorous approach.
Nothing more than 3 days old.
Oh, don't worry yourself. Anything I bring you will be so fresh.
The title role was never offered to Peter Cushing. The casting of Ralph Bates as Frankenstein represented Hammer's attempt to develop a leading man for a new generation, a prelude to Bates's title role portrayal the following year in Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde.
How is your brother?
He hasn't been himself of late.
This is the new Dr. Jekyll, the most evil woman you'll ever see. This is the sensuous Sister Hyde, the most evil man you'll ever meet.
Now Sangster reconceived Frankenstein as more a psychopath, as opposed to Cushing's sympathetically ruthless sociopath. A forbidden sympathy, of course, but understandably sympathetic nonetheless.
Step inside. You can't see anything from there.
David Prowse's portrayal of the monstrous creation scarcely foreshadowed his stern embodiment of Darth Vader in George Lucas's first Star Wars trilogy. This version of a Frankenstein monster is too generic, too soullessly robotic, to register as a memorable presence when compared with the distinctive Hammer figures that had come before. Prowse, nonetheless, owes a distinction as the only actor to have portrayed a Frankenstein monster in more than one Hammer film. The second occasion would be Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell from 1974, where Prowse would appear in a more identifiably human-like feral makeup.
You're only interested in undamaged goods. You've got to realize they're all damaged in a little way, or they wouldn't be dead.
The horror of Frankenstein, as a new release in 1970, impressed my mentor, the critic historian George E. Turner, as a betrayal of the genre, quote-unquote, a horror movie for people who dislike horror movies.
Elise, I'm going to have guests for dinner.
At the New York Times, Howard Thomas found the picture not only painless but also fun, until the arrival of the monster, pitting awkward horror against rather bland sheepishness. The monthly film bulletin accused Sangster of, quote, annihilating all the power of the original myth and putting nothing in its place.
They're useless for intricate surgery. Lost all sensitivity.
Hammer Hammer's return to form after the misstep of the horror of Frankenstein also would provide an elegiac exit for founding director Terence Fisher. Peter Cushing returns in consecutive chronology from Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. Having survived that picture's climactic conflagration, though with damage to his surgical precision.
You must restitch it.
I'll do my best.
You will do it correctly. Now, come on now.
The film was completed in 1972, but sat unreleased until 1974. The death of Cushing's wife in 1971, after 28 years' marriage, had left the actor prematurely aged at almost 60 years. Cushing remained game to the last, and the return to the Frankenstein role lent a renewed determination to advance his developing presence.
Go back to your rooms now.
Here now, Baron Frankenstein holds forth as a surgeon known as Dr. Victor in an asylum. He dominates the corrupt and depraved administrator, Adolf Klaus, played by John Stratton, with the possession of incriminating evidence. A young physician, Simon Helder, Shane Bryant, arrives as a captive inmate accused of sorcery and corpse stealing. Frankenstein enlists Helder's assistance in a new campaign of forbidden surgery. The asylum offers an illimitable supply of donors.
He was more animal than human. Neolithic.
Why was he here?
Homicidal tendencies.
A burly and dangerous inmate, Schneider, David Prowse, has received the transplant of the sensitive hands of a newly deceased sculptor. Frankenstein's damaged hands, imperfectly healed from the fiery ending of the prior film, require an assistant, Sarah, Madeline Smith. Simon presents himself as a qualified surgeon. Sarah proves to be Klaus's daughter, who has been mute since an incestuous attack by her father. Schneider, now equipped with new eyes and a stolen brain, kills Klaus among other victims in a rampage. Cushing's dedication remains such that he insisted upon performing a struggle with the monster without the use of a stunt double. Rebellious inmates destroy the monster. The Baron is philosophical about the loss of his experiment.
The creature's dead, destroyed.
Well, that's of no importance. Best thing that could have happened to him. He was of no use to us or to himself. But, next time.
Helder and Sarah look on in bewilderment as Frankenstein takes charge while considering new prospects for his obsessive campaign. There is no decisive narrative closure here, only the implicit certainty that Frankenstein possesses the will to persist. The monthly film bulletin hailed a promising beginning with Cushing wielding authority over a crowd of crazed inmates. Added the reviewer, the authority and atmosphere are maintained for most of the first half, only to be dissipated by melodrama.
Professor Durandal. Can you understand me?
John Elder's indecisive screenplay ultimately works against Fisher's assured direction. Even so, cinematographer Brian Probin and orchestral composer James Bernard reinforce Fisher's authority. And here ends the Hammer saga of Frankenstein and its overriding brilliance, notwithstanding the occasional misfire. While the series can be better experienced as a sustained body of work by Peter Cushing and his inventive evolution of the central character, it remains that the most enthralling entries are Terence Fisher's first two pictures of 1957 and 1958. These become emboldened in retrospect by the psychological conceit of the Evil of Frankenstein, by the provocative soul transference motif of Frankenstein Created Woman, and by Cushing's better-than-the-material handling of the role overall.
Go back to your rooms. There's nothing more for you to see. It's all over now.
For Cinema Force, this is Mike Price, signing off until our next encounter.
all over.